Hello, sisters, and welcome to Go Solo Live. This is Jennifer Buchholz with Transform Via Travel. It's time to sit back, grab a cup of coffee, and enjoy my conversation with Renée Rivard as she shares a bit about living in Panama, Australia, and her work in nutrition and genetics. It's going to be an interesting time.
Welcome to Go Solo Live.
Don't you mean Go Solo Live? Have you ever been asked, why on earth would you travel alone? Go Solo Live not only answers that question, but celebrates life as a midlife solo traveler. This is a safe place for women to come together to reminisce about their travels, encourage others to travel, and to dig into the real lessons learned from these journeys. Now join Jennifer Buchholz with Transform Via Travel as she and her guests share stories of the solo travelers of midlife women.
Today, I'm joined by Renée Rivard, and she's actually joining us live from Brisbane, Australia. Welcome, Renée.
Hi, Jennifer. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well. Thank you for joining me today.
I'm excited to be here.
So we are going to get started, and we established that you're actually from the U.S., and as time has evolved, you've landed for now in Australia.
Yep.
But let's start by digging into some of your solo travel adventures, because as we were talking about you becoming a guest on the show, you said that you were getting a chance to reflect on some of those adventures. Can you share a bit more?
Yeah, it was really interesting looking over the presentation or the format of your show about women who travel alone. And I thought, gosh, I've actually traveled alone quite a bit, but I had never realized or kind of reflected back on any personal growth aspects or reasons that I had been traveling that I, was maybe unaware of, or lessons that I had learned from traveling alone, because I was just always really interested in exploring and finding new things. So my vision and my perspective was always just kind of excited about the new adventures and not looking back. So I really enjoyed kind of reflecting on that.
So what were some of your lessons?
I think, you learn or become aware of some limiting beliefs or fears that you might have that you were unaware of. I mean, everybody's kind of aware of maybe some surface fears or things, but I think because you're out of your comfort zone, you're forced to face some things that you normally wouldn't. So it presents you with these new challenges, and it's always interesting to learn that part about yourself.
Well, and I know I can relate to that. So for me, one of my examples would be bungee jumping. Never in a million years would I have put that on my list of things to do.
Yeah.
But it served to me as an example of, well, I never thought I could, and then I did.
Yeah.
I don't know that I'd do it again.
Oh, seriously? I did bungee jumping. I was the next in line to go a second time. I loved it. That was awesome.
So where's your favorite place to go?
I went in New Zealand. At the time, it was the highest point to jump from, and it was like 109 meters in this little pod that was suspended on cables between two mountaintops. So it was a free fall over this little river below. So yeah, it was amazing. How about you?
I think it must be a New Zealand thing since it originated there. So I think that's one of those, when you're there, you should do what they do. So I went in Taupo.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
And like I said, that would have never occurred to me to do back home.
Yeah.
But let's get your examples of, I didn't think I could, and then I did, or, some of those limiting beliefs that in reflection, you look at a little bit differently.
I think there was a trip that I did, my most recent one. I moved to Panama about 4 years ago or so. I was about 48, 49 years old. And it was kind of on the heels of a second divorce, being on the receiving end of a second divorce. And I decided to, look at my bucket list, and I wanted to be fluent in Spanish. And so I thought, well, I'm alone, and I was living in this city that was fairly expensive in San Diego. And I was kind of in that situation where you're working to live. And I thought, no, I'm on my own again. I'm just going to head somewhere and tick this off my bucket list. Why not? But it was the first time I'd ever traveled to a destination to live without knowing anyone there. And
Wow.
so, yeah, what it brought out in me that I think had normally resisted as a person who, always took pride in being able to do things on my own, is it kind of forced my hand to reach out to friends and family and friends of friends to see if they knew people that lived in Panama. So it kind of created this immediate social network, and me, I think using other information from other people and connections from other people to connect with people in Panama before I even got there. And it was people that I didn't know, but we might have a friend in common. So when I got there, I actually had someone to talk to and a little bit of support.
Absolutely. Well, and the community that we can build nowadays is pretty impressive. In a lot of ways, I've talked to people who said, yes, once I've asked, I can usually find a connection somewhere.
Yeah. That was so novel for me, because I've always been like, oh yeah, I can do this on my own. So yeah, reaching out. And then, it was amazing. People were so welcoming and friendly, and yeah, that community, building that community initially as I got on the ground there was very insightful for me to remind myself, like you said, to ask sometimes. Don't be afraid to ask and connect with people that you don't know.
Well, and what I think when I talk to, people who are local, whether they grew up there or are currently living there, they only want people to really enjoy their experience in their area.
Yes. They all have a lot of pride, as we would, in their country, their community, their neighborhood. And being in a country where they speak another language, the fact that you're attempting to speak their language, they're so encouraging and warm. And yeah, I found that as well.
It makes a big difference. And that feeling of being so welcome, you probably could have gotten that had you gone alone and not had that community first, but it would have taken a lot longer.
Yes.
So I'm going to guess, and I'd like you to share a little bit. How long did it really take you to get acclimated then once you got settled in?
Not long at all. And that when the day that before I flew in, I had kind of researched the area for 2 or 3, 4 months before I went, and I found a Spanish speaking class or course that they also had housing options and accommodation options. And people would also prepare a meal or two for you. So I signed up for that so that I had locals who I was going to be staying with. They came and picked me up from the airport. And so immediately it made that whole transition so much more seamless and personal, and like you immediately were part of that community because you had somebody there, a family member pretty much to pick you up. And then I also connected, I had 2 or 3 meetings set up, like coffee meetings or lunch meetings with friends of friends who I'd never met before. And so, that kind of got me out meeting them. And then we would hook up for like playing tennis or doing different activities. And it just immediately everything started flowing. And then they would introduce me to their friends. And yeah, it flowed so much more easily and helped me settle in so quickly.
What a beautiful web.
Yes, it was.
But, that story, let's just make sure that everybody really paid attention. You were late 40s, had just gone through the second divorce, and had decided to pick up and move to an entirely different place in the world with an entirely different language.
Yes.
That doesn't seem like a super random decision, but the way that and there were a lot of firsts that you experienced when you were doing that, as you've shared. But can we just kind of backtrack through time? Yeah. And you can either go backwards or you can start at the beginning and go forwards, because there had to be some foundation that laid the groundwork for you to be courageous enough to make that decision.
It's interesting you use that word, because I've heard that word a lot in my life as I've explored and traveled. And that's always just been something I've enjoyed. Anything on the horizon was like intriguing to me. And if I had a choice of, $1,000 gift or $1,000 to go travel, I would always go travel. So that always intrigued me. And it was interesting. My mom had told me when I was a little girl, about 4 or 5, she had put me on a train to go see my grandparents up in the northern part of Alabama. And she put me on the train, and when I got off, my grandparents were there to pick me up. And I have no recollection of that, but I suspect even as a little girl that built confidence in being able to go and travel and do things on my own. So that's always been a part of my life and an interest. I've traveled to Germany when I was 16 to go see a friend. When I was 11, I remember traveling with my other girlfriend who was 11 or 12, and we went to spend Thanksgiving with her parents or grandparents in Ohio. And that was from Florida. So yeah, I think all of those little trips on my own, each one gave me, just built upon that confidence of being able to do things on my own. So by the time I was 49, it was like, okay, I just need to kind of research this. And, there were a few new challenges, but traveling somewhere was not scary.
So travel wasn't scary, but that whole solo travel element is, I consider it both a blessing and a curse. There's a lot of things I love about it, which is why I'm doing the work that I do, but there's always some downsides as well. So if you can think about a trip that was memorable for you, especially, if you're thinking about processing some milestones that you were going through during that time, what trip would come to mind, and what were the biggest challenges you faced?
There would be one that stood out that presented a danger for the first time that I had to confront. And I was traveling alone in Italy, and I had met up with a girlfriend there, but she had already been in the city that I had met her in for a few days. So then she took a train and went off to another city. So we would kind of meet every evening or every couple of days at some city and then kind of reconvene on what we wanted to do. But in the meantime, we were completely by ourselves. And I was riding on a train connecting between 2 cities, and this was in Italy. And I had just learned a little bit of Italian. And there was a young man sitting next to me, and we had kind of been talking a little bit. And as we went through this tunnel, the train got really dark. And all of a sudden, he was in my face. It was completely dark in the train, and he was kissing me. Like his lips were on my lips. And this came out of nowhere. We were not flirting. There was just nothing. He was just on me.
Wow.
And so as a single female in a train and in a tunnel that was dark and having somebody else's lips all of a sudden planted on yours, luckily I had taken a few self-defense classes in my past. So I immediately reacted by grabbing a hold of his throat with my hand and pushed him off. And I knew enough Italian and Spanish to yell a command to leave. And so I did that, and we came out of the tunnel, and then there was light, and, I kind of followed up. But as far as that's probably the scariest moment as a female traveling truly alone.
Sure.
But I think, otherwise the challenges that I had in Panama, they were not, threatening. They were actually very growth oriented on a personal level. And I had lived, my whole life really doing things that made me happy. And then when I was living in the middle of rainforest in Panama, kind of in this third world setting where there was relative poverty, the family down the street who had 6 kids, their mom had died just 2 months after I moved in from diabetes. And then my mom, a few months later, was diagnosed with a rare brain disease. And so at the same time, I was turning about 50. And I think all of those moments kind of came together, and it was like, I want to start a business. I want to help other people as much as possible. And it was just this big mindset shift of now wanting to help other people for a living. And there were a lot of challenges, trying to learn about business, being alone in the middle of a rainforest, trying to have internet connectivity where I could learn all of this and implement it, knowing that my mom was dying. And then eventually that's why I left Panama and went back to Florida. to live with my parents and help my mom in her final months. But there were a lot of challenges about realizing some limiting beliefs and overcoming them. It was a very insightful period for me.
So how did you really balance this need to be where you were, yet staying connected with your mom as she was going through her last stages?
Yeah, it was, I think probably the most challenging part was trying to have an internet connection so that I could like Skype with my parents.
Mm-hmm.
And then before she became too ill, they actually came to visit me in Panama and stayed for a little while. But then I think as I realized how serious her disease was, that I knew I wanted to be there, and help Dad care for her in her final months. So, I eventually decided, I needed and wanted to leave Panama, and I would continue on, some of the rest of my entrepreneurship journey while I was, at home. But that became much more important, was to be there, for my mom and for my dad. And I'm really glad I did. It was a whole nother, kind of spiritual and personal journey to help my mom leave the earth. And I think, those are lessons, some of the limiting beliefs that I had to go through and fears that I had to face sitting alone by myself, separated from my parents in that situation, gave me great insight and enlightenment on a personal, and spiritual level. So it was a very profound time. And I don't think I would have had the same experience had I not been by myself, kind of in an isolated area out of my comfort zone.
It's a really good point.
Mm.
And I think when we have that time and space, we process differently than when we're caught up in all of the doing. And my own way to relate to some of that is that I didn't really do my solo travel until after my dad had passed. And my sister and I had about 6 weeks of caretaking from his diagnosis to when he passed. And he was able to pass at home, which was a blessing for us. Please, don't get me wrong.
Mm-hmm.
But because we were so caught up in the day-to-day doing and, putting on the brave face, and I was living there, it certainly wasn't a time that I could process.
Mm-hmm.
Because my focus was on caring for someone else.
Exactly.
And so for me, that came after. And that's actually how all of this work started for me, was in healing from that. And that's partly why I recently completed a certificate program as a grief support specialist. Mm-hmm. Because, and I'm certain in your line of work as well, and we'll talk more about that coming up, that the healthy ways to process grief, there's an important and necessary process that's involved. And when we don't honor that process, it will come back and get us at some point.
Yes. I was, after I was in Panama a year and a half, then I was in Florida helping with my mom for a year and a half. And then this trip to Australia was after her passing. So this trip also, relocating here, I've experienced some immense personal and spiritual growth through the grieving process and through, watching her pass and helping her pass.
So what led you to this next step of Australia?
I think all of my trips generally tend to focus on nature. And in Panama during that time, I was in the middle of a rainforest surrounded by nature and animals, and I was on a lake. Here in Australia, I'm in a valley. It's lush, and I think that's always something that I've enjoyed also, is nature. And it is actually a wonderful nurturer and healer when you're in nature, because whether people realize it or not, you actually connect energetically with nature. And I think that's why it is, there's tons of studies that show the power of healing when you're in nature and interacting with nature, eating food from nature. Those types of things are really important. And I think that's what's always kind of been my my beacon that's drawn me to areas is nature. And that's also kind of what evolved. My business evolved into that area, which is nutritional genomics and how food affects you at a genetic level, and food from nature versus food from a manufacturing plant or made from man. And yeah, so that's my business is evolving, and it's all tying that in together, which is really trying to help people reconnect with nature, which helps them reconnect with themselves. And especially if you're grieving and mourning, there's no better place to be than to, interact with nature.
Absolutely. So what have been some of your best, again, going back through your whole catalog of experiences, what have been some of your best nature connection?
Oh, I've had some amazing ones here. Oh, in Panama, I was walking down this little road that was near my house, this little dirt road, and I would go out with my camera sometimes. And I went out one afternoon, and all of a sudden I saw 2 or 3 butterflies. And then I saw about 10 more, and I was like, oh my gosh, look at all these butterflies. And all of a sudden I looked up, and there were hundreds of these iridescent blue butterflies. They were migrating. I didn't even know butterflies migrated, but they were migrating through, and a couple of them flew by and hit me in the face. Literally, their little wings hit my face. And it was just so amazing. I was like, how often do you get touched by a butterfly's wings while it's flying by? I mean, little moments like that are just precious, and they're profound, and the same thing here as I've been in Australia. Within the first month or two, one of my favorite animals or birds here is a yellow-tailed black cockatoo. They're these huge black cockatoos, and they've got these beautiful bright yellow feathers in their tail. And I was feeling a little down and melancholic one day, and I was just sitting out in the grass out here by my house. And this flock of about 6 or 8 yellow-tailed black cockatoos flew over and then came down really low, and they were spreading their wings and curving around and squawking. And I don't know, it's just, there's an energy there that you connect with that is amazing.
Absolutely. That sounds fantastic.
Yes, it's the list goes on, but those are 2 of the highlights. Yeah.
And so is it important to you, as you say, the list goes on, is it important to you to track those experiences in any way? Are you a photographer? Are you a blogger, or do you journal? Is it important to you for you to share those back out with others?
At times it is. It's funny. I've kind of, I wax and wane in and out of sharing and then coming back to myself. My whole Panama trip, I shared it. And that was the first time I ever did that. I started blogging, and I had my Share Your Nature site, and I had my Panama blog on there, and everything I did, I shared. I think because when I came to Australia, I had intended on sharing and blogging on my trip, but I think because my mom had passed and I was still in that grief and mourning phase, I tended to stay a little more centered with myself. But I love photography, and you're exactly right. That's one way that I do share now more, probably than in the past, is I've got my camera with me all the time, and I'm sharing with the community that I'm living in, and I post it socially sometimes, but that's a big thing that I do is the photography and sharing through that way.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So if you think about the messages that are important for you to either receive about travel or when you're traveling, or for you to share with others when you're traveling, what are some of those messages? I know you have a spiritual element to some of the work that you do, so I'd like to hear that.
Well, and that's very new. Yeah, the spiritual element is very new for me. Since my mom passed, and kind of watching her physical body, realizing that wasn't her. So that's kind of started there. But I think while I was living at home with my parents for that year and a half, and helping my mom pass without trying to help her pass without fear, watching the community support her and my dad. They've lived in that area for like 40 years. And that support by community that affected me profoundly. That was I think for the first time, it gave me a new appreciation of community. So I think it probably built on what I had started realizing when I went to Panama, of having that, making my own community, but then coming and then watching that community where they had lived for such a long time.
Absolutely.
that was key, is either creating or becoming a part of community. I think also, traveling gets you out of your comfort zone, and that's really where most of your growth will come from. Because if you're comfortable, you're not really going to push yourself to be resourceful or think new ways. And when you don't have familiar things around you, or a lot of familiar things, you have to think differently. So it pushes you into realizing some of your limitations and maybe some fears that you were unaware of, because you've got to overcome them in a novel way. So you become very resourceful. So I think, all of that kind of helps you gain confidence then in your abilities.
Do you have an example of a situation where you had to become more resourceful?
Well, there's a lot of them in Panama. Because where I was living, I didn't have internet connection very well, so I was always having to create new ways. Here I had signed up for an online entrepreneur course, and we met like weekly with video chats. And so frequently I would have to either get in my car and go drive to the top of a hill, or I might have to go to a cafe that was, 30 minutes away in order to maintain and be a part of that. I might have to hoist my little Wi-Fi router up on a string up into a tree for the connection to be good enough. I mean,
That's creative.
Oh gosh, there were all kinds of things. And then at certain times of night, the signal was different. So I'd put it in the basket of the pool scoop, and I'd hold the pool scoop in different oh my gosh. But it was important to me to stay connected so that I could learn how to be a successful entrepreneur so that I could help other people. So it was, it was pretty funny. Some of the links I went to get a good internet connection out there.
It is pretty funny nowadays how every single generation of people seems to be dependent in searching for that Wi-Fi signal wherever we go.
Yes. And I was happy. I wasn't connected all the time. I was more than content to be offline and go with my camera off into the woods. Mm-hmm. But there were moments, if I was going to succeed in learning and implementing a successful business, that I needed that connection periodically. So it was, there was some creative thinking around that.
I love it. I think it's an interesting sign of our times, because then we get to that point where we are more disconnected. In some ways, it can feel a little bit disconcerting.
Yes, yeah, it's good to have a balance, and I think if you're connected too much, then you're missing nature. So I agree with you. It's a really interesting time where even people that are remote and very much into living with nature, there is this meshing that needs to occur, some balance that needs to occur to still stay connected. So it's interesting.
Well, and there is something to be said. I think there are more even like retreats or things like that where it is a no tech retreat, which that is interesting, and it has a legitimate place in the world. Yep. What I found, I led a study abroad to New Zealand, and I had about 20-year-olds, and we took them to Great Barrier Island to do some outdoor challenges. And they knew coming into this that they would be about 3 days without technology.
Yeah. They
were fine. It was their parents who were freaking out.
Oh, really? Who couldn't stay connected and see how they were doing?
Exactly. So it is, I think the tide is going to continue to shift and turn. So during that trip, actually, two of the students were boyfriend, girlfriend, and they got engaged on the highest point on Great Barrier Island, which was
how cool.
Awesome.
Yeah, that's so cool.
And all they could do is live in the moment and celebrate with those around them and not worry about posting it to Facebook and getting... They could breathe. It was a wonderful interaction to watch because they didn't have to worry about all the other stuff that goes along with it. They could be in the moment.
What a cool opportunity. Yeah, that's amazing.
Exactly. And funny that, I don't think he hadn't exactly planned the proper time and place throughout. And so the fact that he did it when they were in that more remote, isolated place ended up working out quite well. And of course, we still had pictures and, he made sure that all of that was taken care of, but they could just be them.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And that's what I find. I think that's why I find solace in going into nature, taking nature hikes, even if it's just walking down a street that has a lot of trees and birds or animals, because it puts you in a different place, and helps center you.
It really does. It really does. So I'd like for you to share a little bit about some of the work that you're doing, and not just tell me about your business, but tell me about the path that took you to this work as well, because I think that your travels and your life thus far has led you here.
Yes, very much. And that's what some of the things I started realizing, preparing or thinking about this interview. I was like, oh yeah, well, I guess that did kind of lead to that. So that reflection was very insightful. My interests in life have always been nature or biology related. And then I've always enjoyed cooking as well, human physiology. And I think, as my life kind of meandered along, I lived it doing what made me happy. So I was always kind of doing those things. And it was funny, though, I was working in the corporate world for a little while. It was in medical information and publishing. But I thought, wow, there's these people and they get like super excited about waking up every day because they're making money from living their passion. And I was like, well, what is my passion? So I had for a few years thought, what would I be excited to wake up and do every single day? So that had been on my mind, while I was in San Diego and for a few years. And then, like I said, when I was in Panama and I had that mindset shift, which I guess a lot of people do in their 50s, where you really want to start contributing to others' lives. And I thought, yep, that's what I want to do. I want to be an entrepreneur and start a business where I can help people. I was always inspired by those shows like Undercover Boss and Secret Millionaire.
Yes.
And because, they got to know these people and then they really helped them with financial means in certain situations, preparing for college or their kids' health or something. And I was always really moved by that. I was like, that's what I would love to do. And then, so I think as I had that mindset shift in Panama and that family down the street, the young family, and the mom was only like in her early 40s and they still had 6 kids. And it was a poverty-stricken area, and the kids were, eating all of these junk food stuff from the store, and I could just see that they were on the same path, but they didn't know any better. They were on the same path and genetically going to be prone to the same disease that their mom had.
Yes.
And at the same time, I'm exploring. I'm in these 2 entrepreneur programs, exploring. Okay, what's my business going to be? And so then my mom had this diagnosis, and so here was this, I was in the middle of nature, and then there's disease and health issues and genetics. And I had spent the last 20 years as a medical writer reviewing medical studies. And so that was what I did, was I evaluated the data from medical studies about natural products and drugs and health. So when my mom got ill with this disease that had not been in our family before, I went straight to the medical studies and started trying to determine if it was genetic. And
wow.
And then that's, as I started researching health, genes, food, disease, and all that, I came across this really interesting field of science called nutritional genomics or nutrigenomics, and it's how food affects your genes. And it was so interesting. It was, because it tied all of my interests together, which was biology and physiology and food and genes and everything. So, and then that's when I kind of decided that's what I want my business to, because as I learned and started reading about nutritional genomics, I became empowered. I had my aha moment, and I was like, oh my gosh, I have to share this with everybody, which was, you have control of your genes and your genetic destiny. So your genes do not define your future. They're actually a history of your past.
Interesting.
A recording of your past. And so for me, it was so empowering, and it was all tied. What I was really interested in was the area of how food affected that, your genes and how they work, and your genetic destiny. Of course, there are other things that are involved too. Stress management and activity and movement, sitting, all of that ties into how your body thrives or not. But the food aspect really interested in me because you could get down to the genetic cellular level of how everything works in the body. So, I was just like, oh my gosh, if people knew that the food they're eating is actually turning on or turning off disease genes, certainly they would go, oh, well, then I'll choose this one because it's turning them off. Unfortunately, It's not quite that simple, but for people to choose one. But that was kind of my message that I wanted to get across to people, was like, you've got a choice of turning on or off your own disease genes and controlling your genetic future. And the best decision is choosing food from nature. Again, it's getting back to nature. When you go to food that is from nature as it is, as you see it, that's the most gene friendly. And that's how you turn off your disease genes.
So as you're traveling, I know one of the challenges that a lot of people have is healthful eating while they're traveling. One, because there is something to be said about just that, like, pure enjoyment of food when you're traveling and indulgence. Mm-hmm. But also, this idea of we don't have to necessarily worry about ourselves. It's like taking a vacation from our self-care. So have you looked at, just your general suggestion about eating close to nature is pretty legitimate all the time. Yeah. But have you looked at that combination of making good choices related to food while traveling?
It's hard because when you're traveling, you're in a very man-made environment and people want things quick and easy. And the quick and easy things are the things that actually end up being poisonous to your body. So for me, if I look at it very simply, then it makes it very easy to make a choice. When I look at a fruit, a vegetable, or maybe some animal protein from an animal that's been raised in a healthy environment, like it's out in its natural environment grazing and it's not pinned up eating food that's not. When you look at those food options, that is nature's medicine. And when you look at anything else, it's man's poison. Unfortunately, it's poison, and it's known to be. And so I break it down as kind of shock and awe as that sound is, that it's poison or medicine. I mean, that's really what it is. So for me to make a decision on choosing food and knowing that disease that my mom had is a potential, it's like Russian roulette. Do I want to take that chance of eating food that may activate that gene that I might have or I might not have, or some other disease gene that I don't know I have?
Absolutely.
And so when traveling, unfortunately, there's a lot more to eating healthy food than the food itself. And it's the mindset and it's what the food means to people. So processed food actually stimulates the reward center at a high level, just like illicit drugs do. So that's why it does seem indulgent, because it is to your brain. And so I think through educating people with information on how the man-made foods actually control your brain and populate your gut with bad bacteria that also make you choose the choices that you choose with food. I think helping people understand that helps empower them with knowledge to choose the right food.
Well, I think what you're sharing with people is super important, and I want to make sure that they would know how to find you so they can connect with you after the episode. And of course, any of this information we will include in our show notes, so don't hesitate to look that up. But Renée, where can people find you?
So my website is called Is Disease Hereditary? And I would love to challenge your audience to try my 7-day veggie brekkie challenge. It's really, you still can eat protein. It's really replacing your white carbohydrates with colorful carbohydrates. And that's a big message that I have is eating colorful carbohydrates. And so 7 days, you get emails, you get recipes, you get a grocery list. So it's a way to start teaching people how to eat healthy every day without having to spend hours in the kitchen or like having to put together a meal plan. It's just keep these basics and then you can fix really healthy meals very quickly.
That's beautiful. So they can just subscribe to that right on your website?
That's correct.
Awesome. Renee, I appreciate you taking the time to share your stories with us today. And what's fun is to think about that. I don't know, do you think you're permanently landed in Brisbane, or are you thinking there's somewhere next for you?
No, I'm actually a little bit south of Brisbane on the Gold Coast, and right now this is where my heart is. So I think I'm going to be here for a while. So I love everything. It just feels right. So I'll be here for a while.
That's a good place to be then.
Yes.
Thank you again for taking your time to join us today and share your story.
Thanks so much, Jennifer. I loved it.
Wasn't it great to hear the stories that Renee shared with us today? I especially liked how she talked about being a caretaker from afar and then knowing when it was the right time to return home to be a caretaker in person. Those are stories that relate close to my heart, and I appreciate that she was willing to share them with us today. Now, if you love these stories and want to help support Go Solo Live, you can do that by making a small financial contribution to the show. There's lots of options we have available at different contribution amounts and great gifts of appreciation from me. Please go to www.patreon.com/Go Solo Live and show your love for the show. That's Patreon, Patreon.com. So we've reached the end of another episode, but the conversation doesn't have to end there. Just go to www.transformviatravel to join our email list. Remember, Go Solo Live is on Twitter @Go Solo Live. If you've liked what you've heard, don't forget to invite your friends to listen to us. And if you're interested in being a guest or know someone who would make a great guest, please email me directly at jennifer@transformviatravel.com. And until next time, remember, go solo, not alone.